do an intro here in a minute. I want to let you know that one of our members took a spill down in the cafeteria here just a few minutes ago. And two of the members are on a little late calling in.
Thank you.
And us right now to check her out. It seems that she's okay, but they just want to make sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Rita.
Well, I want to welcome all you fellow survivors and families to our February meeting. By the flurry of emails and letters, you may have already know that my name is Wayne Nichols, a fellow survivor since 1953 and a member of APA since 2015. Last month, your board of directors elected me as your president. For the past month, thank you. Please hold your applause till I'm done.
Did you make sure everybody gets one out?
For the past month, I have been poring over documents to try and wrap my arms around the history of APA. And the one thing that kept coming up in the history was how the board of directors, both past and present, kept up with the various guest speakers and any applicable information dealing with post-polio syndrome. They also found unique ways to stimulate the fellowship within our group by breaking bread together and attending various outings. I'm happy to announce that your 2020 board is planning to keep the fire burning. So, now I would like to introduce your 2020 board of directors. Rita Carlson, she's our first president, public relations. Billy Pond, Billy here, second vice president and interim treasurer. Barbara Mayer, our secretary, who's been doing a great job for how many years now, Barbara?
6.
Okay.
That's what I know.
Pat Harris, our members advocate. Leslie Shulgin, our SNAF director. Allie Harris, our registration records and operations director. Nancy Winter, who does our newsletter. Belinda Whitaker, special events coordinator. Yeah. She's already got a list of ideas. And then our 2020 volunteers is Alice Stockton, Allison does our web, the video, and audio director. Lynn Frisco, who handles our Facebook and social media director. Vicki Crowell, who does our photo and history. Kathy McIntyre, arts and postcards. Charlotte Terry, our outreach team leader. Barbara Ruskis is our news and proofreader. Carol Crumby, our outreach director. She's also on our fundraising, mainly. In case you haven't heard or read any emails, we are signed up with Amazon Smile. I hope everyone has seen that.
Yes.
Please, if you're going to shop on Amazon, we get 0.5% of every sale that goes on there. So it's a great way of bringing in funds into the organization. If you don't have the instructions on how to get on there, I'd be more than happy to share this with you later on. And now I would like to hand over the mic over to Rita to introduce our guest. Thank you.
Our guest today is Dr. Mark Pollack, who is a practicing physician specializing in sleep disorders and pulmonary medicine. He will speak on sleep disorders common in the survivors of polio. He founded the first sleep disorder center at DeKalb Medical Center, now Emory Decatur Hospital, in 1995 and has dedicated his career to compassionately serving patients in the Atlanta metro area for nearly 30 years. Dr. Pollock leads Pulmonary and Sleep Specialist, a private practice in Decatur, Georgia, focused on sleep and breathing disorders. He has been named by the Atlanta magazine in the list of top doctors 2019 for sleep disorders. He is a summa cum laude graduate of the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia in biochemistry, and completed his medical degree in Vanderbilt University in Nashville, where he achieved Alpha Omega Alpha recognition. He completed an internship and residency in internal medicine at the University of Texas Southwestern School of Medicine in Dallas, Texas, followed by a pulmonary and critical care fellowship at Boston University in Boston, Massachusetts. He is quadruple boarded by the American Board of Internal Medicine with certifications in internal medicine, pulmonary, sleep, and critical care. So if you'll welcome Dr. Pollock.
Thank you, Rita. Everybody can hear, I hope?
Yes.
So I see people I recognize in the audience. Thank you for inviting me. This is an honor, pleasure to be able to speak to a group of people that have been touched in some way by polio. And I'll just have to give you a small anecdote from my past. And my early exposure to people with muscle disorders was in fellowship and in Boston. And one of my mentors was a gentleman named Barry Make, who is a well-recognized pulmonologist, was very interested in muscle disorders as how it affects the respiratory system. And early on, my exposures to people with respiratory failure with muscle systems was colored by a mandatory experience in the iron lung. And so everybody, all the fellows had to spend moments in that, and it was fortunately we're way beyond that, but it was quite an experience. We have come as a society, as in medication, in medicine, so far in what we have accomplished in people with polio and other muscle disorders. And it has been just an amazing journey to see that accomplished over time from what I can only imagine, can only partly imagine what people went through when they first had polio in the 40s and 50s to what we today can approach. My talk here really is more geared to sleeping, and I probably won't touch as much about the more severe situation of respiratory failure, although that's certainly something that I deal with in my practice. That's not the common situation. And the common situation is what I would guess, each of you have been touched with over time. And sleep disorders as a whole, statistically speaking, touch at some point in your life 70% of people. So these are very common things, and you don't have to know somebody with polio or have had polio to have experienced a sleep disorder. And so while there's some twists here that I might mention that deal with patients who have suffered that problem, that's not the common scenario. And common things being common, I don't see any zebras in this room. We've heard horses. So for that being said, I thought we would start with what is normal. And we all sleep. Why do we sleep? Well, sleep is in every animal. I mean, fish sleep, our pets sleep, insects sleep. So there's something inherent in humanity as well as the animal kingdom that makes us sleep. Now, we all may sleep in different ways, and we all may sleep for different reasons in terms of all the animals, but basically we define sleep as some reduced responsiveness. That reduced responsiveness is characteristic. There's a position that most of us sleep in. We're generally lying down. Some of us might fall asleep in a chair, but we prefer to lie down. And it's also characterized by less movement, some kind of minimal movement. And that sleep reverses with stimulation. So that's sort of basic. Everybody can kind of accept what is sleep in that way. But why do we sleep? Why in the world do we even need sleep? Well, sleep conserves energy. And so over the course of the day, you spend a lot of energy just sitting like you're doing. There may be some of you that lose your energy and fall asleep during this talk. I hope not. But, and you're saving more energy than the rest of us, if that's the case. But your brain is very active all of the time, including when you sleep. Your brain activity, the metabolic activity of the brain, reduces to about 30% when you're sleeping. So you're conserving energy. In that process, you're also replenishing the chemicals and chemistry that is needed to do your daily task. So as we think, as we hear, as we move, as we do anything that requires our brain, that brain is releasing neurotransmitters that require a lot of energy to produce and to release and to take up. It's an active process. So when I do the simple matter of this, starting in my brain, an area of my brain has said, you better go move your arm, release this neurotransmitter, it gets released, and then sends the signal through my spinal cord to do this. But in the meantime, there's more to it. It reuptakes those chemicals, it reprocesses those chemicals, and it restores those chemicals. So all of those issues are important in terms of a spending of energy. I start with normal because when we start talking about abnormal, it gets down to that problem. How chemicals are released, how chemicals are taken up, does it work correctly? This is the essence of sleep problems. It's also important that your brain remove waste because all of this work produces waste products. And if the waste products just built up over time, then we would become sluggish, we would probably sleep more, but we would be less responsive. There's other sleep benefits that occur. If you've had children, one day you wake up and they say, God, they look like they've grown an inch. And there's truth to that because growth hormone is tied to sleep. So you actually, and even as adults, we release growth hormone during sleep. Now, it's more important in children than it is in adults, but that's when you release growth hormone. And your cortisol levels, which cortisol is a protein that is released, a hormone that is released in response to stress, but it's also in response to just being awake. If you didn't have cortisol and you tried to stand up, you'd get dizzy and fall. If you didn't have cortisol and you wanted to run to get the phone, you wouldn't have that ability to adjust to that stress. That cortisol level fluctuates over the course of the night depending on stages of sleep. Your thyroid hormone also is tied to sleep. And of course, thyroid hormone gives us part of our energy, and problems with regulating that thyroid hormone might affect our energy levels. and it's tied to sleep. So all of these things are tied to sleep, and if we don't have normal sleep in some way, those chemicals that are so important for our day-to-day can be affected. So there's also some thoughts on immune system. So people that don't sleep well don't have as good of immunity. So they get more colds, or they get sicker, or they can get, some people get cancer. Also a failure of the immune system in a sense. And sleep can lower your immunity and allow you to get more ill more quickly. Most of you have probably heard that memory is laid down in sleep. And if we didn't have sleep to, in a sense, help us with memory, our brains would become overloaded. I can't imagine remembering every single thing. We'd like to remember more, maybe, but every single detail to be drowned with those details. The walk from the elevator here, I need to remember every single thing I saw. No, it's not that important. So I need to trim that memory. I had to focus on the things that are important. The meeting you, the talking to you, my talk here, those are all important. I have to keep that in my memory. But the small details of how many sips of water I took, I don't need. And so your brain is good about that. And that's what it does at night. It trims the things you don't need, and it reinforces the things you do need. It's particularly important in emotional memory. It's important in the things you're trying to learn, but also emotional memory. So things that are vivid to you during the course of the day also get moved into more solid memory at night. So you might associate the smell of bread to thinking about when you were a child and your mother was baking bread. That emotional memory is laid down at night, that type of emotional memory. So what happens during sleep? What other things happen during sleep? Well, you probably recognize, or should, that your blood pressure should go down during the night. Your pulse rate should go down during the night. Your temperature generally goes down during the night. Your depth of breathing goes down during the night. And so that's all part of energy issues that we referred to earlier. You're saving energy by less pulse, less blood pressure. You don't have to keep your body as warm. That requires certain metabolism to keep your body at 98.6. So you don't have to do those things at night. And your brain regulates those things during sleep. So again, the rest of your body also conserves energy. Now, unfortunately, if you have some sleep disorders, all of those type of things are affected. So some people, for instance, and we'll get into this, sleep apnea. One of the problems with patients with sleep apnea is their blood pressure can be too high. Their pulse rate can be too fast. We call the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that is not under your mental control. The sympathetic nervous system is what controls your heart rate. I can run to the door. I don't have to tell my heart, speed up, you need to run to the door. That sympathetic system automatically does that. When I look at a bright object, my pupil constricts, right? Otherwise, anybody had their eyes dilated before? You go outside and your eyes are dilated, way too bright. You can't stand the pain of the sun. Well, I don't have to say, hey, it's bright outside, go ahead and constrict, right? It's an automatic system. The sympathetic system is that autonomic nervous system. Well, in people with certain sleep disorders, that autonomic system is stimulated. So then, people with these sleep disorders, they don't have the same regulation. It's revved up. And that puts a strain on the body. Puts a strain on the heart, on the brain, on the circulatory system, on your immune system. It can affect blood sugar control. So a lot of things can play into this. This kind of moves into and I hope this is not easily seen, I didn't really have a great way to display this. And this kind of moves into the what's abnormal about sleep. Probably the most common sleep disorder, not one that I see people specifically for, but probably the most common, inadequate sleep. Inadequate sleep time. We all, as we've developed, we have decided, we can turn on, we no longer have to depend on the sun to have our activities, guide our activities. We have lights. We have computers. We have iPhones we can look at night. We have activities that we have stretched the course of the daylight hours to any time we want. And as a result of that, often we cut down, we give up sleep time. And so there is an age-related requirement for sleep. And that's what this shows. For instance, as a newborn, up to 3 months, they require, between 14 and 17 hours of sleep a night, a day, not a night, but in 24 hours. And then, as you can see, as it gets further down the age spectrum, less and less sleep is required. But I want to bring up, and some of you may have teenagers. I think there's a teenager close to me right here. And the normal teen time for age 14 to 17 is about 8 to 10 hours a night of requirement. And that often is very tough to achieve. And it's tough to achieve because people get up early for school, they have activities after school, they may have homework issues, after they've done the things they have to do, they have requirements on them to, they may be social, they may watch TV, they may play a game, but all of that tends to cut into their night's sleep. And so as a result, many teenagers become sleep deprived. And how does that affect them? Well, it affects them in terms of school performance, it affects them in terms of moodiness, and it affects them in terms of their normal social interaction. And there can be a cumulative, I'm just talking about teens, but as you can see, as an adult, the normal time is about 7 to 9 hours, and as you get over 65, we always talk about over 65 as a special group, it tends that sleep time is even less. So between 7 and 8 hours is sort of normal sleep time, what normal is. I mean, normal is average, right? Normal is, what does normal mean? 95% of the people in an age group will have that characteristic. That's what normal is. Well, that means that there may be 5% of the people on either side that it's normal for them, but it's just not normal like everybody else. So you can't be exact on this, but I would say that if somebody is not getting enough sleep and they are tired during the day, then you have to go back to how much time do I need? And so the goal in those people who are tired during the day would be in an adult between 7 and 9 hours. Is an older adult between 7 and 8 hours. That would be a good way to approach that. Now, if I feel great and I get 6 hours a night and I'm not tired, I'm not sleeping, I'm not yawning, and I can get by the day without a problem, and only getting 6 hours, well, maybe that's normal for that person. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. They're just in that 5% that is not normal for them. So you have to this is not hard and fast rules, but these are good rules to follow because, as I said, this is probably the most common sleep disorder out there because we don't sleep, as Americans, as general, we don't sleep enough. And that's my point. So anyway, we'll move on. So what do we get if we get enough sleep? What is good about that? Well, it's been well recognized that just thinking clearly is dependent on sleep time. So your ability to, a lot of us I know that guy's face, but I don't know what his name is. Or I saw that, I can't think of the name of the place we were supposed to go. You know, we all struggle at times with coming up with the exact thought. That is worse when you don't have sleep. So your memory is really dependent on this. If you want to keep your memory healthy, get enough sleep. There's also good data with people who have inadequate sleep time. For whatever reason, they have a higher rate of physical illness and a higher rate of depression and anxiety. So, again, get enough sleep. There are measures, you know, doctors and researchers like to measure things, the measures of quality of life. There's all sorts of questions and questionnaires and polls that say, what is your quality of life? And you write this down. The people that score highest on that are people that get adequate sleep and feel good about their sleep. Now, this is probably a two-tailed thing. You know, I've been talking about insufficient sleep. Well, what about the people that sleep too much? Because there can be people that sleep too long. And so, like I said before, that range might be, let's say, over 65, 7 to 8 hours. But if that 70-year-old is sleeping 10 hours, that's probably too long. And it's because, and there's reasons why that might happen, but for whatever reason that is happening, that is associated with higher death rates, higher mortality. So people who sleep too long also don't live as long. People that sleep too short don't live as long. So the sweet spot for adults is in that 7 to 9 hours. 6 hours and less, a little bit higher death rate. 8.5, 9 hours or more, a little bit higher death rate. So, not that, you know, sometimes you need more sleep. You know, sometimes you have been deprived of sleep. You stayed up late, you did something, you worried about something happened. You didn't sleep. As a result, you might sleep more the next day. That's fine. That's not the average. I'm talking about over time, over a year. Your average sleep time needs to be in that. Over a year, if your average sleep time is too low or too high, something's not right. So that's what you should focus on. You know, people say, well, I didn't sleep last night. Okay, well, that happens. No big deal. But what happens as you age? Because there's an age-related change in sleep. I showed you this graph. We'll just go back quickly. This graph, the reason this graph is curved like this is because there is an age-related change in sleep time that's required. This is not because of habit. This is what your body demands. This is what happens. So there's an age-related change in sleep. And among the things that happen as you get older is that as you sleep, instead of you sleeping solid this whole night, you wake up more. And there's more wake time during that night. And then, so that arousals may happen, but then the arousals lead to wake time, more time. So the efficient sleeper, somebody goes to sleep, falls asleep like that, wakes up like that, oh, I'm great. But the person who has more arousals, you might wake up and fall back asleep. Then there are people that wake up and then stay awake for a period before they fall back asleep. So that's more common as you get older. It also takes you longer to fall asleep. So may spend more time in bed to fall asleep. And it may be that timing shifts. And that time shift has to do with what's known as circadian rhythms. Let's go back to this. So what is a circadian rhythm? Circadian really means about the sun. That's the definition. And so all of our, as humans, all of our sleep is tied to the sun. So when that sun gets up, when that sun rises, that bright light wakes us up. When that sun goes down, we're more likely to be ready to go to sleep. Some people take melatonin, But the natural melatonin happens only when it's dark. When you have dark, your melatonin rises. That's a sleep hormone. Helps you fall asleep. When you're exposed to bright light, TV sets, computers, iPads, Kindles, exposed to bright light, your melatonin goes down. So if you're trying to encourage sleep and you're trying to get your melatonin, your natural melatonin, what you're supposed to have to help you fall asleep, if you're trying to get that, encourage that to go to the normal levels, don't look at bright lights before you go to bed. And so those things are critical and very common that I hear about. But in any event, back to the circadian rhythm. So we tend to fall asleep, let's say the typical person might be 11-ish, and the typical wake time might be 6, and just this is as an example. But as we get older, maybe that moves from 11p to 10p, and then maybe arising at 5. And some people push it further, 9p, and they start arising at 4. And they might come to me and say, I'm pretty frustrated. I'm waking up at 4 o'clock. What can you do about that? And I said, well, what time do you go to bed? 9. I said, that's normal. Because you're going to sleep at 9, you're falling asleep, and you're sleeping your 7 hours, and you're getting up at 4. What do you want me to do about that? You want to stay, you have a choice. You can't have, I can't eat all this cake and not exercise and then think I'm not going to gain weight. There's a consequence, right? The consequence of getting the opportunity to go to bed early is the getting up early. That's your consequence. That's your cost. So it's a choice in that situation. If you want to sleep till 6, go to sleep at 11. If you want to sleep, you want to get up early and be an early riser, that's fine. But we don't always have choices in that because some of it is our brain wired that way. Among you, there are probably night owls. And among you, there are probably so-called larks that like to get up early. So, and that's hard, you're probably born that way. And there's familial situations where the clock, the very creative, the gene that controls your sleep time is called, very creatively, clock. So clock gene can be different in different people. And so there's always going to be a tendency to either get up early or stay up late. And that clock gene can affect that. And then as we get older, there is this tendency to go to sleep earlier. The frustrating part of that is waking up early. But that's what you're seeing. Okay, so people ask me all the time and say, well, should I nap? What about napping? And I say napping is fine to a degree. There's there is a circadian rhythm about napping. It's natural. If I were to draw the circadian rhythm, it looks like tendency to fall asleep about 11 or 12, tendency to wake up here about 6, tendency to stay awake but fall asleep and get tired again about 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, tendency to be awake again until mid-evening, mid-afternoon, mid-evening, tendency to fall asleep again. So there's these two humps. The hump of tendency to fall asleep at night, and the smaller hump, tendency to fall asleep in the day. So there is a natural need or desire to have a nap. And naps can really help. A short nap can increase your alertness. A short nap can help you feel restored. A short nap is part of their natural thing. But if you nap too long, that leads to what's called inertia. Sleep inertia is the longer you stay in a nap, the longer you want to stay in a nap. And so it's hard to get out of that. A lot of us have had the experience, God, I took a 2-hour nap today, I feel worse than I did when I went to bed. Because you develop this inertia. develop the desire to stay asleep. So it's better to nap short, almost a power nap. So a 10-minute nap, 15-minute nap can really be restorative, but a 1 hour, 2 hour nap can be detracting. And then kind of the timing. So I kind of indicated the circadian rhythm. There's a tendency that napping is naturally, if, again, this normal person falls asleep at around 11, that person will generally have a nap tendency about 1 or 2. Now, if the nap is 4 to 5 in the afternoon, that might be too late. And then that late nap is going to affect the ability to fall asleep at night. So you have to spread these out and kind of use your natural rhythm to say when is it good to take a nap. Again, we're talking about adults. Children are different. Infants are different. You know, we're not talking that. That's not the point of this talk. The point is about adults. So let's move on. So what about specifically problems about sleep? And we've touched on some of that, some of my thoughts on that. But symptoms of that sort of relate, that are common symptoms, but also relate and more frequent in people with post-polio are what's listed here. Daytime sleepiness, big levels of fatigue, less leg restlessness, this headaches on time waking up. So these are symptoms that are reported by post-polio survivors and more frequent than the control group of people that don't have that. Now, not all of these are sleep disorders. They may affect you, but they're not all related to sleep because it's hard sometimes, and this is when I'm seeing a patient in the office, sometimes it's difficult to tease out the difference between their sleepiness and their fatigue. And so, because they overlap, they're not like distinct one way or the other. It's difficult sometimes, and we spend some time in the office trying to sort that out, and that's what you may have to think about when you're with the doctor or you know, independently think about this. Because fatigue is really, in my mind, a lack of energy, a early inability to carry on what you desire in your day, and that might be cumulative or worse as the day goes on, versus sleepiness is I'm yawning, a nap would restore me, I could fall asleep like this, and yes, you could say that overlaps, but and that's why it's hard. It does overlap to a degree. But there is a little bit of a distinction between sleepiness and fatigue or tiredness. And, you know, you as somebody with post-polio, this is a struggle as what to do for you, because I've just given you the party line about napping. But sometimes the fatigue in your problem causes you want to lay down and rest. And so that may stretch the nap out. That makes it difficult because the longer you stretch the nap out, that might help the fatigue and tiredness, but it might affect your ability to sleep at night. So there's a balance, and that's hard to achieve, the balance, but it's the recognition of that balance that will help you make a choice of how much time you spend just resting and how much time you spend napping and what your sleep timing is. So there's no easy answer to that, but it's sort of individual. What about particular problems? And these three things I'm going to focus on the rest of the time. Sleep apnea, limb movements, and insomnia issues. So a lot of you have heard about sleep apnea. What is sleep apnea? It's a breathing problem during sleep. Excuse me, your airway, your airflow through the nose and mouth gets cut off sometime during the sleep. And when it gets cut off, there's a reduction in the amount of air that's moving in and out of your body, and that results in two important things. Well, more than two important things, but at least two important things. One is a drop in oxygen levels. So, of course, we all know that oxygen is important. We have to have good oxygen to function normally. So a drop in oxygen level is not good for you. And it's also associated with an arousal from sleep. So an artificial arousal. So if I had somebody if I'm treating somebody with sleep apnea and they're having, let's say, 20 events per hour of sleep, then every 3 seconds, wake up, wake up, wake up. Not so good for your quality of sleep during the night, right? 20 hours a night, 20 hours a night, 20 hours an hour waking up. So of course, there's levels of severity of sleep apnea, but that arousal from sleep is what causes so much sleepiness and fatigue. And oxygen is important for other reasons, but it's the arousal that's important here that causing your problem, of your fatigue problem. Anyway, so there's different kinds of apnea, of course, and I won't get deep into that. There is so-called obstructive sleep apnea, where your airway gets cut off, usually from the tongue or palate or congestion or blockage up here. It's a blockage that occurs. And then the second type is we call central apnea, where your brain is not sending the normal signal. And this, without the signal to breathe, you just lie there and don't breathe. Don't try to breathe. Either one. Either way, it's bad. So this is obstructive sleep apnea. This is the most common. Why it happens. Hopefully it won't set off the signals here. Here, you see the back of the tongue. This is open, an open airway. You can see the tongue ends here, the back of the throat ends here. You can see good airflow, normal. Over here, the tongue has fallen back, blocking the airway. So now air can't get through. That's obstructive. That's the essence of obstructive sleep apnea. That's the most common reason for that to happen. Now it happens more in certain individuals. You can turn me up or whatever. It happens more in certain individuals. So if you're overweight, it's more likely. If you have got a fat tongue for one reason, it's more likely. If you've got an overbite where the upper teeth are in front of the lower teeth, that's more likely. If you have dentures, it's a little bit more likely because the bite closes in and that moves the position of the tongue. There are neurologic things that can make it more likely, but suffice it to say that's sort of the point here. So what kind of symptoms, if you have sleep apnea, what kind of symptoms should you be looking for? What might you have? Snoring would be the most common. Now, there's a lot of snorers. I mean, most of us, with the exception of very few people, are over 40 here. So in men at least, 50% of men over 40 snore. So it's pretty darn common to snore. But snoring is not apnea, but snoring is a symptom of what can be apnea. But people that snore and also have sleepiness, then you got to think of sleep apnea. People have other symptoms, can have other symptoms as a consequence of the disrupted sleep. Irritability, moodiness, memory problems, concentration problems, excessive urination at night, sweating at night. These can all be associated with sleep apnea. And so when I talk about the sympathetic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system we referred to in the very beginning, I was trying to give you a basis to understand this. Sleep apnea activates that system. That's what causes you to urinate too much and causes you to be restless and causes the blood pressure to go up. And all the other things that are consequences of sleep apnea are because of this activation of the nervous system, autonomic nervous system, that I mentioned was so abnormal earlier. So that's the bad things about it. So what can happen? Well, people with sleep apnea often will have low oxygen level. That will cause elevated blood pressure, higher risk of stroke, higher risk of atrial fibrillation, which is a rhythm problem in the heart, higher risk of dementia, so early memory loss. There's an accident risk of people that have sleep apnea, so more car accidents, more truck accidents, more industrial accidents happen because of sleep apnea, if you are a truck driver and you have to get a DOT license to prove your abilities to operate a big rig or commercial trucking vehicle, you have to be screened for sleep apnea. The reason that is that people who have sleep apnea and are truckers have a higher rate of accidents. And so as a protection for the public, the government enforces testing of these truckers, and I see truckers every week, several days a week, of people coming in screening for sleep apnea, because people have found that if you treat their sleep apnea, their accident risk is lower. And trucking companies like this, because when they have screened all their truckers and have all their truckers treated, lo and behold, less accident risk, that means savings on their insurance. So there's a financial incentive for the trucking companies because they don't have to pay as much insurance. And there's an incentive on the part of the drivers because many of them don't even know they have apnea. And that this is a good health benefit for them. So anyway, that it interacts in our daily lives in a lot of ways. So I handed this out in the paper that I sent. I don't know where my here it is. And it's on your. You can take this home. And this is not exactly it's not a perfect questionnaire, but it's useful, it's helpful. It's actually used a lot in anesthesiologists to estimate your risk of undergoing surgery, because people with sleep apnea have a higher risk of complications of surgery. And you can take this. I won't spend a lot of time going through all these questions, but once you kind of go through this, and it's called Stop Bang, and you'll see why based on this sheet. All these questions. If you fill this out, and you have, it does require you to calculate your body mass index. If you don't know that, there's a way, it's written down here how to calculate that. So it does require a little math. But if you've calculated that and you play this game here, and you have 3 items, less than 3 items, your chance of sleep apnea is about 15%. So it's not 0, unfortunately. It's a screening test, but less than 15% if you're under 3 or less. But if you're above that, 4 or 5, particularly 5 or more, your chance of having apnea is 80%. So it's pretty good for apnea, moderate to severe apnea, but it's not so perfect. So, I use this at the risk of discouraging you if you have sleep problems and you're a 2. But I also take the opportunity to say, if you've got, 4 or 5s, you probably ought to be checked out. So anyway, that's that. So, okay, so what about how sleep apnea might affect somebody with post-polio syndrome? So particularly people that have had any kind of respiratory issues with polio, anybody that has vocal issues with polio, these people are at higher risk for muscle weakness of their respiratory muscles. And in that case, there is deeper oxygen drops with sleep apnea. So we've talked about anybody with sleep apnea can have low oxygen, but people that have respiratory problems particularly can have even lower oxygen level, which of course increases the risk and makes it harder, the consequences worse, basically. And people who have scoliosis or kyphosis, so bending of the spine in certain ways. Scoliosis is the side-to-side bending, and kyphosis is the front-to-back bending, more like this. But either of those situations, or the combination of those two things, diminish your pulmonary reserve, diminish the capacity of your lungs to carry air. If you have diminished air carrying capacity, it would stand to reason it would be easier for your oxygen levels to go down. And so if your oxygen levels go down some, it will go down worse when you lie down in bed, as everybody's does, but worse even still. And then if you have apnea, it will deepen that oxygen drop. So all these things I've mentioned are respiratory effects. So what about, how do we figure this out? I mean, I've told you how you might screen for it. I've mentioned some symptoms you might have if you have it. If you are diagnosed, if you come to your doctor and you're worried about this, it's usually the spouse bringing somebody in, husband or wife. Sometimes they come willingly, and sometimes every night we have the janitors cleaning the scuff marks on the ground where they've been dragged in. So either way, if we make that, we try to make that diagnosis. Often it requires a sleep study. There's different kinds of sleep studies. We fortunately now have a home sleep test, a test that basically a small box about this size that you records the sleep, and then it measures oxygen coming off the nose, your airflow coming off the nose, oxygen coming off the finger, and a small belt that goes around the chest measuring effort to breathe. And then after 1 or 2 nights, we can get an answer on that. Now, that's not always appropriate. It's not always an appropriate test. It is nice when it's appropriate because then you can sleep in your own bed. But it depends on the situation. And so your doctor would have to be the right guide of, is it better to be in lab, meaning at a facility that is attended by a certified technician and does a little bit more wiring up of you, versus home. And again, it just depends on the situation. Now, if you were diagnosed with obstructive sleep apnea, not central sleep apnea, there are several options of what you might do. A lot of us have heard about CPAP and may even know people with CPAP, or maybe some of you might have CPAP. CPAP is continuous positive airway pressure. It's a device that machines about this big. They're very quiet these days. You wouldn't know they're on. There's a tube comes out of the machine about 6 feet, so people can turn and toss and move, and it still stays connected. A mask of some sort. This gentleman on the screen is wearing one type of a newer modern mask. It's pretty small. It just blows air. It takes the air and delivers it to the back of the nose, which goes down to the back of the throat, which in that air pressure splints the airway open. So I showed you these pictures where the airway collapses because of the tongue. This pressurizes that airway, sort of distends the airway, keeps the tongue from falling back, no longer obstructed. Air can flow easily in and out of the lungs, and that stops the sleep apnea. It stops snoring as well. CPAP is a single level of pressure, bilevel. Maybe you've heard BiPAP or bilevel. Those are 2 pressures. Really depends on the situation that you have, what type of machine you need. There are people that either don't like the idea of CPAP or can't stand the idea of CPAP. They've tried it, and some of those people are candidates for an oral appliance, so something you wear in your mouth. When you wear it in your mouth, it pulls the lower jaw in a forward direction, more of a, like that. And that opens the airway up, and that might be appropriate in some people. There are surgeries that have been invented for this. Plus or minus. If you have really big tonsils, that's pretty good to do that surgery. So children that have sleep apnea, oftentimes the reason is they have big tonsils. So it works nicely in children. But there's not many adults that have big tonsils. There are certainly people that I see that have that. And that might be appropriate. There are other surgeries that are more invasive. Surgery success can vary. If you've got a definite site that, it's right there that we can fix, then that works. If we can't say, well, I think it's over here and it may also be there, but also there, that's not as successful. And some of you might have heard of a company called Inspire. And Inspire is a medical device company that has invented a device that in a sense is a pacemaker for the breathing system. It's implanted surgically, and it stimulates the nerves at the base of the tongue to make the tongue contract and therefore open the airway. And it times that contraction with your diaphragm, which is, of course, your main breathing muscle. And so when that's synced together, then the airway opens and then you can breathe. That's a more extreme treatment, I would guess. It has only in the last few months been approved for Medicare patients. It's tremendously expensive. Not everybody is a candidate. Some people are. But, maybe in the future we'll have more of that type of thing. There's certainly research in this area. CPAP got a bad rap and gets a bad rap from people. Some of it rightfully so. Some of it is in the era when the machines were loud and not responsive and didn't work that well, and the masks were heavy and uncomfortable, and we do much better. The concept, unfortunately, is the same. You still have to wear something, but it's not as, it doesn't deserve the rap it used to get. So anyway. So moving to a sort of a different topic, and that is restless legs. And restless legs is defined as a need to move or a desire to move or an impossible urge to resist movement of the legs when you're at rest, typically in bed, but it can occur at rest like you are now. It is relieved by getting up and moving. So it has to have both, actually. You have to not only have this urge, but you also have to you have to get up to relieve it, and that does relieve it. That's sort of important. And it's not other things. So it's not cramps, it's not arthritis, and it's not pain in a muscle or a joint. That's restless legs. Common, very common. So there are interesting things about restless legs. There was a report in the last few months that people with restless legs, don't know why, have a higher risk of depression and suicide. Why that is, I don't think we fully understand, but that was just published, like I said, in the last few months. There are people that have restless legs because their parents had restless legs. So there is a genetic link. Probably the two biggest categories of people that have restless legs are some kind of problem with iron, either metabolism or deficiency, and then idiopathic, meaning we don't know. So a lot of research going on so to help understand the we don't know category, but for the easy category of iron, people with iron deficiency often will have restless legs. It's easy to fix, just replete the iron. You don't have to be anemic to have low iron, so you may have low iron even if your blood count is normal. It takes a special test, ferritin, just a blood test, to make that diagnosis. Iron deficiency and metabolism is more common in pregnant women. And so you see in pregnancy that problem happen. Renal failure patients have it more often, and certain other types of neuropathies I mentioned here have it more often. It is a problem in the brain, a problem with what's known as dopamine, a neurotransmitter in the brain, and it doesn't work like it's supposed to in the brain. And what happens, because the sleep is shortened, it's hard to fall asleep with restless legs, then that adds to the fatigue and sleepiness, and it might carry on into the night. So people who have restless legs may also have its sister diagnosis of periodic limb movements of sleep. Doesn't roll off the tongue, but that's what they have, PLMs. And you can have PLMs without restless legs, or restless legs without PLMs. The PLMs are the version of restless legs that happen while you're asleep. And oftentimes the patient doesn't even know they have that, it's just there. So, yes?
Do you want to wait for questions?
I would. I think we're on our last sets, and then we'll come back. Thank you. So So insomnia is kind of the last but major category of people, of things that can go wrong with sleep. And we talked earlier about what's normal, how many hours you need. And insomnia is a pretty broad category of problems. Difficulty falling asleep, difficulty staying asleep, difficulty with waking up too early. And there's a lot of potential common causes of insomnia. But some of the things we do to ourselves. So we might drink caffeine too late in the day. So after 2 o'clock, if you have insomnia and you're drinking caffeine after 2, don't come see me for that question. Stop your caffeine after 2 and see if that works. Alcohol. So alcohol tends to help people fall asleep. Some people will take a nightcap to do that. But then what they don't realize is they've delayed their REM. When the alcohol's metabolized, usually 2 to 3 hours later, they start having more arousals. And alcohol worsens sleep apnea. And so that can lead to a whole set of other problems. So not good as a sedative, not good as a sleeping pill. Alcohol is not the right way to treat this problem. We talked about circadian rhythms as a part of sleep timing. I made a little bit of a fun of the person who tries to go to sleep early and then expects to sleep late. Not going to happen. That circadian rhythm is what we're talking about with sleep timing. The teenager that likes to stay up till 1 o'clock on the weekend. Talking to you. In the beginning of this conversation, we said we were going to bring you up and talk about your sleep, right? Okay, don't worry, you're going to do that. All right, so at 1 o'clock, if a lot of people that have children struggle with, let's say they have a bedtime at 10, but then on the weekends they're having their fun and they're up till 1 or 2, and then they expect on Sunday night to be able to fall asleep and get up early the next morning, and that's just not possible because your brain is trained to stay up late on the weekends, and then you're expected to get up early. So that's hard to change that shift. So people that have shift work, or people that like to have fun on the weekends, or people or nurses that, for instance, they might have different. They might have to work 7 to 3, and then later 3 to 11, and later 11 to 7, and all of a sudden they're doing 11 to 7, but they have family responsibilities, and they have to be up in the day. So all this struggle, the brain gets confused. What am I supposed? What do you want me to do? You want me to sleep, or you want me to be awake? And so you have to have a routine, and that sleep routine has to do with the timing of your sleep and keeping it more rigid, and also a little bit about expectations, meaning we know that normal is that 7 to 8 hours. Don't expect to get 10 and need more than 5. So expectations are important. And then a lot of people suffer this problem of they get in bed and all of a sudden their mind just races. I was fine all day, and then I lay down and then I just can't clear my mind. And it could be something serious they're thinking about, or it could just be mundane. What I got to do? I got to go to the grocery store tomorrow. So it can be anything, but there's this sort of switch that sometimes turns on people at night. And for a person like that, it might be that they need to set aside, if that's a common thing, set aside some time before they go to bed. If it's a serious problem, to kind of work it out before they get into bed and say, well, I've compartmentalized that. I put it in the closet. I've done with them. Been there, done that. I've got it figured out. I don't need to take it to bed with me. Or it might be some way of diverting attention, like relaxation exercises, things like yoga or tai chi or breathing exercises. Or it might be things like meditation, or it might be listening to soft music or boring music or white noise music. I was at a concert the other day, and I laughed at this. You can take some water, excuse me. I had a concert, and I laughed at this person who says that she travels all the time, and she takes her sound machine with her. She often spends the night at a friend's house. And nobody wants to have her come over anymore because her sound machine is chirping crickets. And so the house sounds like crickets all the time. Anyway, smoking delays sleep onset, and of course, and maybe in some of your problems, pain syndromes can disrupt sleep and cause you not to fall asleep or wake up during the night, and that can be an issue. So kind of some gentle advice, and some of this is on the sleep hygiene tips on the back of this page, and that is things like try to find that sleep window. I'm going back to the circadian thing we talked about earlier. There's a tendency to fall asleep at a certain time. Everybody has that tendency. Identify your tendency. When is it you should fall asleep? And take advantage of that. So if you know you're always sleepy and ready to go to sleep at 10:30 at night, don't stay up to 11:30 at night because you wanted to watch that movie. Try to make it to the 10:30 and be rigid about it. And then try to keep that routine we talked about. And then I've mentioned several times bright lights, screens, TVs, Kindles, computers. Don't take those to bed. Expectations we talked about. If you do nap, I have patients that come to me and say, well, I'm sleeping, I sleep from midnight to 5. It's just not long enough. How long do you nap? Well, I usually nap from 3 to 5 in the afternoon. Well, that's 7 hours, right? 7 hours and 24. You're getting enough sleep. It's just that you've moved it to 2 hours in the afternoon and 5 hours at night. So what do you want? As a patient, what do you want? Would you rather take the nap and have only sleep 5 hours? Or would you rather sleep 7 hours and not nap? And that becomes a choice, and you have to sort of figure out what's good for them. But you can't have 7 hours at night and 2 hours a nap. 9 hours is more than you're allowed. Sorry, you can't have it. So, but if you're sleepy, you may not be getting enough sleep, and maybe there's something going on in the night. Something like pain waking you up, leg movements waking you up, apnea waking you up, something that interrupts your night. Talked a little bit about this. I'm going to skip it. So what about medicines? Because a lot of you take medication for your medical problems, and medicine can play a role in a sleep disturbance. And it's difficult sometimes to find choices that are more friendly to sleep than it is because we're treating some disease state that is important. But as an example, some of you might be on pain medications. Some of those are narcotics. Those as narcotics can cause more apnea, so disrupt your sleep. And as they wear off, that can cause you to wake up from sleep. Sedatives, and the big one to me is antihistamines. So people might take Benadryl before they go to bed. That's one of the constituents of NyQuil and Sominex and other over-the-counter sleep aids. Look at the box. If it says diphenhydramine or Benadryl, diphenhydramine is the generic for Benadryl. That can cause both a hangover effect and it can disrupt sleep at night. You might fall asleep earlier. That's true. It gets you sleepy. But it affects other things. So it, for men particularly, well, women too, it causes increased bladder tone, and therefore you have more nighttime urination if you're taking that. So that disrupts sleep. And then you can have this long-term hangover, so you just feel groggy in the morning. Certain antidepressants, depends on which one. Some of them tend to be more sleep-inducing, and some of them tend to be more wake-inducing. And then, and it really depends on which one it is. Caffeine we talked about, and there are kind of hidden caffeine, so everybody knows tea and coffee, right? But a lot of people like chocolate before they go to bed. And so chocolate has a lot of caffeine into it. I'm sorry, my foible, I love chocolate M&Ms, the dark chocolate M&Ms. They are delicious. But when I was having those at night, I wasn't sleeping at night. I said, I can't eat my chocolate M&Ms at night? No good. Anyway, I stopped that. I'm sleeping again. Ice cream, tea, protein bars. So some of you might eat protein bars. And look at the constituents of the protein bar. That often has caffeine in it. You don't know it, but it does. So got to be careful when you're taking that. And certain pain relievers. So Goodies powder, Anacin, certain things have caffeine as a constituent. You might be taking something for chronic pain or a headache. That's going to wake you up. So we talked a little bit about this. Let me skip it. Pain. So the only other thing about pain syndromes are said, other than narcotics, is it's common for patients to take gabapentin and pregabalin. These are two common neurologic agents that help sort of calm the nerves in a sense. They were originally developed as anti-seizure medications, but they found a big role in pain control. These actually can be fairly friendly for sleep in terms of bringing on sleep, and they don't disrupt the sleep we call architecture, the way sleep is supposed to be laid out during the night. The downside is that sometimes they cause sedation, and so it may be a dosing issue. If you're on a high dose of that, it may be hard to overcome that the sleepiness that you get with those medicines. So, just kind of wrapping up some things. If you still feel like you're stopping and you're high, and you're not being treated for sleep apnea, go to see your doctor. You have to do something about that. Look for regular sleep hours and enough sleep time. And enough is not just the 7 to 8, but not too little and not too much. So enough is what is right for you. That's what I mean by enough. Exercise. Over and over again, exercise has been proven to help people with sleep problems. It doesn't have to be you get on a treadmill and do 30 minutes, but every single day, 20 minutes of something, walking, going up and down your stairs, walk around the house 3 times, or 20 minutes, go up and down your hall 20 minutes. It doesn't really matter what you do. That helps sleep. And so it is good if you have the physical ability to do something aerobic. That's always great. But if you can't do the aerobic activity, that's fine. You still need to do something. And the something is some activity for about 20 minutes a day. That really makes a difference in insomnia. If you look at patients who have insomnia and say, do they get help by sleeping pills or do they get help by exercise? Exercise helps hands down more than pills, 80% of the time. Exercise. That is what you need. If you're not doing that and you're having insomnia, start. Light exposure. We've talked a lot of times about too much light, bad for your sleep, and the exposures we've talked about. So, now I'll open up to questions.
What if you have someone that has had all the symptoms, done everything right the whole time, and still only gets about 2 to 3 hours per night's sleep?
Okay. Well, I guess it depends on what the right is. So one of the things that's difficult about sorting out sleep problems is that there are many things that affect sleep. And what I often use is the analogy of getting good sleep is sort of like making soup. And soup has, a good soup is going to have plenty of different kinds of vegetables and some salt and maybe some tomatoes and liquid. And sometimes if you leave the wrong ingredient, it doesn't taste as good. And so a lot of times it's hard as a patient to figure out exactly what is left out of this mix. And so the other thing that I like about soup is soup is always better if it's cooked a long time. And so a lot of times people will do the right things, but they haven't done it long enough. So as an example, very simple case of somebody who's a shift worker, and they simply have a circadian rhythm problem. They've been up at night, and then they try to shift and try to get their sleep adjusted. We know what their problem is. It takes 3 weeks to get them settled. So even though they do the right things, even though all the things they've followed is correct, it takes 3 weeks. So unless you do something as a routine, you fix each of those things as a routine, it probably, I don't say it won't count, but it's not enough. It has to be continued for 3 weeks without variation. So part of the problem that you have to address is, do you have all the components in your soup, and is it cooked long enough?
I think it is.
Then you need a doctor to help you sort that out.
Well, if you've been to the doctors and have the CPAP machine and they kind of dismiss you now because you're not getting sleep, is it all because of the brain?
Well, I think, everybody, so generally to restate the question in a different way, if somebody has one disease and we fix that disease, supposing if we fix that disease, so that's one question. Is it okay, can you have something else that's causing a problem? And I would say none of us are simple, right? We all can have multiple problems. If I picked anybody in here, it's likely I'm going to find a fair number with hypertension and diabetes, where they're not necessarily related, but because of the incidence of those diseases, I'm going to find those two together. So just because you have sleep apnea, which is about 5% of the population as a whole, but more often as you get older, doesn't exclude other issues. And so I would argue that a person that has that problem needs to look beyond apnea.
It's been going on for years.
It's the first time you met me, I don't know.
Does polio have an effect on it?
I have the same problem that you do,
Yeah, me too.
and I don't have sleep apnea.
Yeah.
I've been that way for years.
No matter where you go, it's never improved, or whatever they prescribe has never helped at all.
4 hours is a lot of sleep.
It's a lot.
If I get 4 hours of sleep.
And I do a lot of exercises. I try to do, I don't drink the alcohol or anything like that, but I still only about 4 hours at the most.
Yeah.
Well, sleep problems are frustrating, obviously. There are people that it is simple, and some people it's often complex. It's not so easy. So, I think when you have sleep problems and you're just like any other medical illness, if you're not getting the answers you need to look beyond your first attempts. You have to kind of go outside the first box. And so there may not be an answer for you. I may not be, if I were a person, I may not be the expert for you. But sometimes you throw enough darts at the wall, you're going to hit a bullseye. And so you have to see. So, yes.
I have the same problem they're speaking about. It's gone on for years. And I finally did low-dose Ambien. I haven't heard you speak about it. Zolpidem Ambien. And it's working. I'm so thrilled to get it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Yeah, so the question, and I'll restate the question, is that those sleeping pills such as Ambien, are they appropriate, and what's my opinion about that type of thing, right? So I think this is an evolution of a problem, of an evolution of a solution that I think the jury is partly out on. And like many medications, sleeping pills are two-edged swords. They have upsides and downsides. And if you look at the upside of medications like Ambien, a number of people will feel like their frustration levels of falling asleep or staying asleep is better than it used to be. And maybe the sleep is not perfect, but it is improved. That's generically speaking about sleeping pills. The downside of generically speaking about sleeping pills is that there is literature and evidence that there is a higher risk of death in those who use those pills. So we don't know for certain why that is. We know that if you look statistically at enough people, the classic study on this was the nurse health study, which looked at 50,000 nurses over from the 60s to now, and followed them along and looked at a lot of different things, including drug use like Ambien. They found there was a statistical association between routine use of Ambien, or not just Ambien, let's say generically sleeping pills, statistical risk of sleeping pills, and a higher risk of death. And that was independent of heart attacks and strokes and accidents and things like that. So we don't know why that is. That's never been explained. So I think, when I, as a physician, talk to patients, I try to give them these balances, because it's really about everything we do is about choices. And there are people that their sleep quality is so poor that they understand as a risk that might hurt me. That drug is not perfect, it might hurt me, but I want my sleep. And there are some people that hear that discussion and say, I'll stick with my bad sleep. Okay, so that's not my decision exactly, but it's my job to tell you what the advantages and downsides of that drug is. And then you have to decide. Now, speaking specifically about Ambien a minute, the downside about Ambien, it is currently approved for 30 days or less of insomnia. And so we do have other drugs that are approved for long-term insomnia. So if I were prescribing drugs for insomnia, I would, and it's a long-term situation, I would prefer to pick a drug that is approved for that kind of situation. Because at least then I have some level of confidence that the drug company has studied this in a long-term way, and we have data on the safety of that long-term. Now, even in the long-term drugs, none of them have been studied more than about a year. So we don't, that's the downside, I guess. But the truth is, a team of experts smarter than me have gotten together and said, Ambien is 30 days and these other drugs are longer. So in my practice, I don't prescribe Ambien unless it's a very short-term issue and or a very intermittent issue. So there's some people, I only need Ambien when I travel to China. I only need Ambien. I have a big lecture tomorrow. I gotta do that. So there are situations that are different, but it's my opinion that I won't use that as a routine long term. That's not.
What's the other? What are the others?
Well, there are several other drugs, and there are actually some newer drugs coming out that will be interesting to see what they do and how they do. But without getting into all these details, I think I've said it in a sense. You should listen to the patient. You should find out what they're telling you. You will give them the options, and then let them decide. So you've been waiting patiently.
So I was curious when you were talking about restless leg, because I've experienced restless leg as a side effect to a medication. Stopped taking the medication, it stopped. But something that I've done for most of my life, I would refer to more as like a twitching as I'm falling asleep, where sometimes it's just a mild thing, and sometimes it's so violent that I'm starting to fall asleep and it wakes me up again. Is that the same as restless leg, or is that something different?
Yeah. It sounds this just to sort of restate and augment some of the discussion here. So restless legs, I did not mention, there are drugs that definitely cause restless leg, and particularly there are certain stimulants of the CNS the central nervous system, that can affect and cause legs. And if you can find that association, that's one of the simpler things, besides iron, simpler things to fix restless legs. So restless legs really goes back to this generally twofold diagnosis, which is twofold symptoms in general. The irresistible urge to move and relief upon walking. Those are pretty critical things. So what you're describing is almost like you're falling asleep and you twitch or move or jerk or something. Is that clear? Is that right? Yeah. So that sounds a little bit more like what I would call a hypnic jerk. And it's a natural, it's a normal thing that happens. And some people have it more often and some people don't. It
So
sounds a
it's
little
not
bit like that.
necessarily associated with polio then?
No, no. Hypnic jerk is a something that occurs at the onset of sleep, that something with, we don't really understand it, but something with the brain is shutting down, and as the brain shuts down, there's a movement or jerk or twitch. Nothing serious. No treatment's needed. It's not going to harm you. You know, it's unpleasant, but it's not a bad thing. And that's the usual. I would think that's more likely what you're describing.
Thank you.
I had a question about all the dead people. Did they factor in the dead people that had like insomnia or sleep deprivation that didn't do medication? Somebody possibly that it could be, rather than the sleep medication, could have been the underlying factor of whether they got medication or not, that they had a sleep disorder. Is that factored in at all?
Yeah. So the question that we're asking, I think, is in the studies that I've quoted about sleeping pills, did they control for other possible reasons for early mortality? That's sort of what you're asking.
Yeah, I mean, did they include specifically people with sleep deprivation? You know, that didn't.
It's a control group.
That
Yeah.
didn't, you know.
So this was a large study, and in the group it was not a selected group in the sense of looking for a specific disease. We didn't include or exclude polio or heart disease or diabetes or whatever. So in a large enough sample of people, you are bound to have insomnia people and people that have trouble with inadequate sleep. And this was, over 50,000 people. And so the researchers were not able to come up with any association, whether it be sleep deprivation or inadequate sleep or insomnia, as a connection to explain why they might, have that. Now, it is fair to say, and this is where it can become trickier, not in the study. It is fair to say that the insomnia is so bad you're truly getting 4 hours of sleep a night, then there is a higher mortality of people that get only 4 hours of sleep a night. Now, that is a difficult, that's sometimes difficult to pin down, harder than you would think. You would think that you could ask a lot of people and they could be accurate in saying, I get 4 hours of sleep at night, and if they are correct, and we did studies on them, we should find a high correlation and say, you say it's 4 hours, and we did a sleep study, and you're right, it's 4 hours or 4.5 hours. It's pretty close to that. But in fact, that's not what happens. And the problem is the perception of sleep is often different than the reality of sleep. And so, not to say that we shouldn't be treating perception, that's a different discussion. But oftentimes we find that what people feel is not sleep, they are really sleeping. And so there's a name for that. We call it paradoxical sleep. That's the term.
Are you saying that where they are getting sleep, they don't think they are?
Exactly.
Yeah, 'cause I think she's been on Ambien for years.
Yeah, so there are people that are there, exactly. So people that are around and common think they are sleeping 4 hours, 5 hours, and when you measure them in a longitudinal way over several weeks, and you say, well, the studies show that you're sleeping 6 hours, 7 hours, and they say, no, I'm not. So it becomes, it's a discussion of what the brain is really doing and what you're perceiving. And so sometimes that, we used to call it sleep state misperception. But so either way, sleep state misperception, I think, says it better to me. But paradoxical sleep is misperceiving what you actually sleep. And so you have to, sometimes you try to figure that out. Now, what I try to do is hard. This is a tough area to figure out, and I think insomnia would be a fruitful area for research, or is a fruitful area for research, because A, it's common, and B, it's frustrating for everybody, providers and patients. But one of the best ways to figure it out, or help figuring it out, is a device called an actigraph. So, and it's in a sense, a watch or a device that measures movement. And so the theory is that when you sleep, your movement is less, right? That's what we've been talking about. You have to move less when you're asleep. You should be, except if you have periodic limb movements or restless legs or something. So, so you look at a study of a patient who has actigraphy, you should see a flattening of that level of activity over the course of the night, and that correlates very strongly with sleep. The difficulty is that not many people use actigraphy because it's expensive and it's not reimbursed, and it becomes harder to use a tool that is not readily available. So what I have often done is had patients use a watch, like an activity watch. And some people have those apps. You may have that on your phone, that you can look at your activity, and you can do a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or some kind of device that measures activity in it, and you can look at a graph and say, oh, I slept 7 hours last night, or I was active, my sleep was bad, or whatever. And if you use it, you don't push the limits of what you're interpreting. It can be helpful to see how many hours you're really sleeping or not sleeping.
I thought that was what a CPAP also did for you.
So let me come back to that. So the actigraphy on a watch that you can get, over the counter, $100 or whatever, can give you some feedback of your activity at night. Where I would read it's pretty good at is when you fall asleep and when you wake up. Don't read too much into it. I'm in REM sleep for 30% of the time, and I was fragmented sleep at this amount of time. It's not so good at that. It's pretty good at duration. So what I would look at in your situation, somebody's situation, they don't think they're getting enough sleep. That's one of a good way to look at that. Am I getting enough sleep? Is it real?
Back to the ambient thing. She's been taking it forever, but she only takes half a dose. But is there something? What would be a safer? Can you list out a couple of things that she could talk to her doctor about that would be safer alternatives if it is going to be a long term? Because apparently she's been on Ambien way longer than
Longer than
Longer than
30
prescribed.
days.
What
Well-
doctor do you go to?
in Covington.
They won't give me Ambien.
I was so pleased. I was a new patient. She gave me
Yeah.
4 refills on Ambien.
They won't give me
They
Ambien.
won't give it to
No,
you.
no,
Yeah, that's
all the
what
long-term things they say does not work.
Yeah.
But the Ambien did for the 30 days.
Is it falling asleep?
So
or
come back to
staying asleep?
so those who wear
It's
So-
wonderful on it.
I take Tylenol because I wake up and can't go back to sleep.
Yeah.
And that's helped me a lot. And they had to kind of play with the dose. It's a form of doxepin. It's a much smaller dose, and they usually give doxepin.
Is that what Doxy said?
So other drugs that you might consider, doxepin is an approved drug that does work long term. It has goods and bads about it too. No drug is going to be perfect in this situation. There's like I said, there's no perfect answer. Some people will take, there are some sort of longer term, like Sonata type drugs that are longer term drugs. And the drugs that keep people asleep tend to be these we call non-benzodiazepine sedatives. So benzodiazepines are things like Valium and Ativan and used to be Dalmane and different drugs like this. Those are considered not so good because they're more addictive than Klonopin, clonazepam. Those are not as good for your system. And the non-benzodiazepine category is better. There's a drug called Ramelteon, which is it's a drug that is similar, has very similar characteristics to melatonin. And to go to the melatonin question, melatonin is really better for somebody who's having trouble falling asleep. It's not a great drug just to kind of keep people asleep. So your sleep onset is regulated by melatonin, but your sleep continuity is not necessarily really regulated by melatonin.
Is it bad to take melatonin?
It's bad. So I think you know, like anything, you want to be taking a drug that's in the appropriate situation and the appropriate dose. So melatonin is often helpful in circadian rhythm disorders, trouble falling asleep, and people that might have some natural reason to be lacking melatonin. The normal dosage of that is probably in the 4 to 6 milligram range, and higher than that becomes excessive. In the true elderly population, it has a higher incidence of brain dysfunction and seizures. In pregnant women, it's not recommended, and in children, it's not recommended because it has effects on hormonal levels in children. So it's not a simple answer, is it okay? Because there are groups that it's not okay in. And the other problem of melatonin is that there is no standard melatonin. So there's no, like if you go to your pharmacy and you're prescribed a drug, whatever it is, there's a guarantee in a sense that you're getting that drug and it's not adulterated and it's in a range of milligrams that they say it is. If you go buy melatonin over the counter, it's not as regulated. And different manufacturers can have different amounts, and it's not as inspected as how much amount is in there. So you might buy 4 milligrams today, change brands, and it's 2 milligrams tomorrow or 8 milligrams the next day, or even in one lot to another, it's not as regulated. So there's some risk involved with that. Not to say we will never do it. I'm just when people ask me that question, I say no answer is simple here, right? Because when you're trusting over-the-counter medications, really not over-the-counter medicine. So acetaminophen would be over-the-counter, but it's trusted. But if you're taking a natural food supplement, like melatonin is considered, you don't have the same level of trust. Not to say we would never do it, but the trust level is lower.
One last question. Can I make an appointment?
Yeah, my card. Yes, you.
Would you comment on the relationship between sleep and dreams?
Sleep and dreams. So we dream during sleep. Dreams that you remember, dreams that are really very detailed and rich, are in REM sleep, and dreams that are more sort of foggy and wispy, vague can occur in non-REM sleep. So if I were to wake you, if I were to watch you and know when you're in REM, and I say, wake up, you're in REM, you'd say, oh, I was dreaming about riding my motorcycle. And if I were to wake you up in non-REM sleep, then I'd say, what were you doing? You said, I'm not sure. I'm just not sure. I knew I was. So more specific dreams are in REM sleep. And REM sleep comes in a cycle. Non-REM, REM, non-REM, REM. So you go through non-REM, REM cycles over the course of the night. Usually between 3 to 5 of those cycles occur. Those cycles occur on a 90 to 120 minutes cycle length. And each cycle is tended to be ended by REM in the normal individual. So you might have an opportunity to dream 3 or 4 times a night.
Thank you, Dr. Paul.
Any suggestions if you have a spouse who would answer yes to 7 of these questions, but refuses to admit that there's a problem?
Okay, I have a funny way of answering that question. Don't take offense to this. So and this came to me by way of a patient. And it is sort of funny, and it may not be fair, but it's real funny. The patient said exactly what you just told me, that my spouse doesn't come. So we had this conversation. Honey, I know you have sleep apnea. Is your life insurance paid up? Because I'm hoping to get a big payoff at the end. And if you don't treat that, I'm going to get to collect soon. And so, that seems harsh, okay? I think it is a little on the harsh side, so I said, please forgive me. But really, that's what we're talking about here, is that there's a danger in people that have serious sleep apnea. And if somebody has diabetes and high blood pressure, particularly, but otherwise also if they have heart disease and atrial fibrillation, the chances of that person having sleep apnea is probably more than 90%. And people that have heart disease already and have sleep apnea, those people tend to have earlier heart attacks and die sooner. And so even though we've said jokingly, I'm going to collect your insurance, that's what happens in these cases. And so, if he's unwilling to even think about that, then it's almost a death wish in a sense. So I know that's terrible to think, but in a sense, it's a vital issue. And a lot of people don't come because they don't come to the doctor because they're worried they're going to be put on this machine. And they may have good reasons against that. Maybe they're claustrophobic, or they just don't like the idea, or whatever. They don't like that. But for patients like that, we have options. It happens that people don't use their CPAP machines, but a lot of times we will help them through that or find something else to go. And so, it just becomes how important it is. There's some people that just don't like to go to doctors in medicine, and they treat themselves, and we can't always help people. You can't always help them. So sometimes we have to protect people from themselves. Unfortunately, we have parents that protect their children, right? And that's good. But at a certain point in time, he's going to grow up and he's going to be independent, and you're not going to be able to do anything about that. You may not like what he does, but he's going to do his own thing.
Can you make him an appointment and say, we're going to have a surprise date today?
And then I just make sure that we have the cleaning crew to clean up the scuff marks. So, all right. Well, thank you all very much for your great questions and your appreciative audience.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Does anybody else have any checks or anything for me? We're collecting.
I'm taking them too.
Thank you. Next month, we're going to have bingo, and Vicki will be leading that. So you all are welcome to come. We'll have, gift cards and stuff for you. And I thank you so much. Do you have anything, Wayne? Okay. I guess that's it then.
I want to thank everybody for coming.
Yeah, thank you for coming. And
For having this thing.
I have some cookbooks here if you want, and then of course be welcome to take the food. But this is from the University of Georgia, and there's a calendar and good cooking. It's healthful cooking. Pardon? Oh, I didn't know. Oh, really? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Look at these. I didn't see you come in. Thank you so much. How would you like it?